The breaking of bonds, when allies become targets in a world order fractured. The true measure of civilization is not in its monuments, but in how it treats its friends when power makes it easy to forget them. The cold air of the Arctic carries more than just the biting winds of a Greenland winter this January. It carries the palpable anxiety of a people who have unexpectedly found themselves at the center of a geopolitical storm. As President Trump's threats to seize control of the semi-autonomous Danish territory intensified this week, the world watched a familiar alliance fracture under the strain of unilateral ambition. Prime Minister Jens Frederik Nielsen of Greenland stood beside a former leader, reviewing civil preparedness strategies that could soon ask every household to stockpile 5 days of food, a sobering preparation more commonly associated with natural disasters than threats from a long-standing protector. "We must be prepared for all the things that may happen," warned former Prime Minister Mute Bjegid, now a parliament member, his words echoing across the Nordic region where similar survival advisories had previously been issued primarily against Russian aggression. A world turned upside down. The World Economic Forum in Davos, typically a stage for measured diplomacy and economic forecasting, transformed into an arena of thinly veiled condemnation. Global leaders delivered speeches that, while carefully omitting names, left little doubt about their target. Prime Minister Mark Carney of Canada delivered what many described as a searing address about what he called a rupture in the world order. "I will talk today about the breaking of the world order," he began, "the end of a pleasant fiction and the beginning of a brutal reality where the geopolitics of the great powers is not subject to any constraint." Carney, who received a standing ovation, spoke not long after President Trump had posted an AI-generated image on social media showing American flags superimposed over both Canada and the United States, an unsettling visual that only heightened Canadian anxieties about their southern neighbors' intentions. His words carried particular weight given his position leading a nation that shares not only the world's longest undefended border with the United States but also a joint command for North American air defense. "Every day we are reminded that we live in an era of great power rivalry," Carney continued, "that the rules-based order is fading, that the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must." The European response: unity against brutality. Across the Atlantic, European leaders responded with a mixture of defiance and disbelief. President Emmanuel Macron of France, also speaking in Davos, concluded his address with a pointed statement: "Europe has little regard for bullies and prefers the rule of law to brutality." The French president raised the possibility of Europe deploying its trade bazooka, the bloc's anti-coercion instrument, against the United States, a scenario he acknowledged seemed crazy. "I do regret that," Macron added, "but this is a consequence of just unpredictability and useless aggressivity." This European unity manifested concretely as Denmark sent approximately 100 soldiers to western Greenland, accompanied by the Danish army chief, in what analysts interpreted as a demonstration that the country was taking security concerns seriously while simultaneously reinforcing its territorial claims. Yet Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen remained in Copenhagen rather than attending Davos, addressing her parliament with sobering clarity: "On both sides, a trade war will cost jobs. On both sides, it will harm the economy." The human cost of geopolitical ambition. Beyond the diplomatic posturing and economic calculations lies the human reality of 56,000 Greenlanders who find their homeland suddenly transformed into a geopolitical bargaining chip. Prime Minister Nielsen expressed the collective sentiment when he described President Trump's social media provocations as disrespectful, affirming that Greenland would respond through formal diplomatic channels rather than engage in public spats. The territory's leaders have consistently reiterated that Greenland is not for sale and that its people do not wish to become part of the United States. Nielsen stated plainly that if Greenlanders had to choose, they would prefer maintaining their current relationship with Denmark, their former colonizer, over annexation by the United States. This sentiment echoes throughout the Nordic region, where countries have long prided themselves on stable governance and predictable international relations. Now they face the unsettling prospect that the greatest threat to their security comes not from traditional adversaries but from a long-standing ally. The wider implications: trade as weapon. The Greenland confrontation represents only one front in what appears to be a broader pattern of using economic leverage to achieve geopolitical objectives. President Trump threatened to impose 200% tariffs on French wine, including champagne, as pressure for France to join his proposed Board of Peace for Gaza, a body critics say could undermine the United Nations. French Agriculture Minister Annie Genevard described this approach bluntly as blackmail, telling French television, "It's shocking because it's brutal, it's done to force compliance." The sentiment was echoed across the French political spectrum, with former European Affairs Minister Nathalie Loiseau declaring on public radio that positive parenting is over with Mr. Trump and that today is the time for firmness. These economic threats have practical consequences beyond diplomatic friction. The United States represents the largest foreign market for French champagne producers, making the tariff threat particularly destabilizing for an industry that has cultivated American appreciation for decades. A fracturing of trust. What makes this moment particularly poignant is the contrast with what came before. The transatlantic alliance, forged in the fires of World War II and tempered during the Cold War, was built on shared values and mutual trust, precisely what now appears to be unraveling. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick attempted to downplay the situation at a Davos panel, characterizing it as a kerfuffle between great allies that would ultimately end in a reasonable manner. But his reassurance rang hollow against Prime Minister Carney's declaration that we are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition. Even within the United States, dissent emerged. Representative Mike Lawler, a Republican from New York, acknowledged broad bipartisan opposition in Congress to any use of force in relation to Greenland, even as he expressed support for acquiring the territory through negotiation.